All right, well, welcome back to Reflections, everyone, where we talk about all things Church of Christ with the Elijah message. It is wonderful to be back with you, spending this time together. So we're continuing our discussion on the oneness of God. And I want to look at just one more reference, just because I think it's interesting. And I don't know if it teaches oneness theology, but it comes from the Lectures on Faith, which was a series of lectures from the School of the Prophets, the ministerial training of the early saints. And it dates to 1835, and it was part of the Doctrine and Covenants. And it was part of the Doctrine and Covenants in the reorganized church tradition until 1897, and a part of the Church of Christ, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Mormon Church, the Utah Church, until 1921. So let's take a look at lecture number 5. I'm going to start in paragraph 2. This is just so interesting. There are two personages who constitute the great, matchless, governing, and supreme power over all things. This is really interesting. I think it's interesting that it doesn't say persons, but it says personages. And in the 1800s, a very common meaning for that term was a person of distinction, a person of noteworthiness. And so are these noteworthy, distinctionable persons, you might say, who constitute the great, matchless, governing, and supreme power over all things, by whom all things were created and made, that are created and made, whether visible or invisible, whether in heaven, on earth, or in the earth, under the earth, or throughout the immensity of space. They are the Father and the Son. The Father being a personage of spirit, glory, and power, possessing all perfection and fullness. The Son, who was in the bosom of the Father, a personage of tabernacle, made or fashioned like unto man, or being in the form and likeness of man, or rather, man was formed after his likeness and in his image. And that sounds a lot like Mosiah 15 that we read in a previous video. That there is one God that manifests as the Father, transcendence, and the Son in immanence. And it's interesting, we don't know who wrote the Lectures on Faith. We believe it was Sidney Rigdon for the most part, and Joseph Smith might have done some editing, but we don't know. But this is 1835. And so it's not talking about, at least it seems, about a Trinitarian view of God. It seems more like a oneness view of God. And this is interesting, that man was formed after his likeness and his image. So God created us in his image in Genesis. And so we were created in the image of Jesus. It might, be saying here, he is also the express image and likeness of the personages of the Father, possessing all the fullness of the Father, or the same fullness with the Father, being begotten of him. So it seems that Jesus is the only begotten of the Father, in the bosom of the Father, because this is the manifestation of the Father in the flesh, who is known as the Son, and was ordained from before the foundation of the world to be a propitiation, to be a reconciler, for the sins of all those who should believe on his name, and is called the Son because of the flesh, and descended in suffering below that which man can suffer, or in other words, suffered greater sufferings, and was exposed to more powerful contradictions than any man can be. And this refers to perhaps the passion of the Christ. Being betrayed, being crucified, being beaten, being mocked, being scourged, having your disciples, not stand right next to you, having Peter denied you, having Judas turn you over. Powerful contradictions that any man can be. But notwithstanding all this, notwithstanding the passion of Jesus, notwithstanding being face to face with all the powers of darkness, with all the powers of sin, death, and Satan, he kept the law of God and remained without sin, showing thereby that it is in the power of man to keep the law and remain also without sin. It is in the power of the flesh, because Jesus was God in the flesh and sinless. And also that by him a righteous judgment might come upon all flesh, and that all who walk not in the law of God may justly be condemned by the law and have no excuse for their sins. And that's kind of what Paul was saying. And it does sound like Paul was wrestling with, how to preach the law of Moses to Gentiles. And what he seemed to come up with is this idea that the law is good because it tells you what's right or wrong, but Jesus saves. And he, being the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth, and having overcome, received a fullness of the glory of the Father, possessing the same mind with the Father, which mind is the Holy Spirit, that bears record of the Father and the Son. And these three are one. Or in other words, these three constitute the great, matchless, governing, and supreme power over all things, by whom all things were created and made, that were created and made. And these three constitute the Godhead and are one. The Father and the Son, possessing the same mind, the same wisdom, glory, power, and fullness, filling all in all, the Son being filled with the fullness of the mind, glory, and power. Or in other words, the Spirit, glory, and power of the Father, possessing all knowledge and glory, and the same kingdom, sitting at the right hand of power, in the express image and likeness of the Father, a mediator for man, being filled with the fullness of the mind, the Holy Spirit of the Father, or in other words, the Spirit of the Father, which Spirit is shed forth upon all who believe on his name and keep his commandments. And then it talks about how we participate in this. We can have the mind of God, the Holy Spirit of God dwelling in us as well. And all those who keep his commandments shall grow up from grace to grace, and become heirs of the heavenly kingdom and joint heirs with Jesus Christ, possessing the same mind, being transformed in the same image or likeness. We can be in the image of likeness of Jesus through the Holy Spirit that dwells within us. even the express image of him who fills all in all, being filled with the fullness of his glory, and become one in him, even as the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are one. That's just fascinating. That's something to really ponder and think about and pray about and spend time with. Listening to these people try to figure out, what is the relationship of these different manifestations of the one God, that it did sound like that. My brothers and sisters, it's been wonderful spending this time with you, thinking about these things, reflect on them, and spend some time with them. Spend some time with Jesus. Spend some time asking the Holy Spirit to come down and to dwell with you and tarry with you, to stay with you and to reveal the hidden truths. The hidden truths that are made plain to believers who ask in God's name, ask in faith. Father, give me the power to believe in these, to fill my life with your love, to read the scriptures and dwell on every word of the Bible, every word of the record of the Nephites, every word of the Lord, the word of the Lord brought to mankind by an angel, and be overshadowed with the love of God in your life. And Jesus says you can have this. You can participate in this through the Holy Spirit. Until next time, I invite you into the Elijah Message House.